Waiter refuses to serve. Elderly black woman, stunned when her son reveals who she is. When an elderly woman walked into an upscale restaurant, no one expected that her quiet presence would expose a shocking truth and leave the entire room in stunned silence. The golden glow of the evening sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Bellevue, an exclusive fine dining establishment in Charleston, South Carolina. The air buzzed with polite conversation, the rhythmic clinking of crystal glasses, and the soft melody of a jazz trio playing in the corner. This was the kind of place where power lunches turned into lucrative deals and anniversaries were celebrated with bottles of aged wine. The entrance doors swung open, and in walked Eleanor Carter, a dignified woman in her late 70s. Though her hair was silver, her posture remained proud, her steps slow but steady. She wore a dark green coat embroidered along the cuffs, and a simple black handbag rested in the crook of her arm. Despite her unassuming demeanor, there was a quiet authority about her, something that turned a few heads as she made her way to the hostess stand. The young hostess offered a tight-lipped smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. "Yes," Eleanor replied with a gentle nod. "It should be under Carter." The hostess scanned the list, and after a moment's hesitation, nodded. "Right this way." But instead of leading Eleanor to the prime seats near the windows, where the city lights reflected beautifully off the river, she guided her to a small table near the kitchen, where the sound of clattering dishes and bustling waitstaff filled the air. It was the worst table in the house. Eleanor didn't complain. She simply took her seat, placed her hands neatly on the table, and studied the menu. But she had barely settled in before something felt off. Ignored, but not unnoticed minutes ticked by. Then more. The waiter assigned to her section, a tall man in his late 20s named Ethan, breezed past her table multiple times without even acknowledging her. His smile, warm and easy when speaking to other patrons, never once turned her way. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stopped at her table. "Sorry for the wait," Ethan said briskly, barely looking at her. "We're really busy right now. I'll be back in a bit to take your order." Eleanor simply nodded, offering a polite, "Take your time." She noticed, though, how the young couple at the next table received immediate service, how the well-dressed businessmen near the bar had their drinks refreshed without asking. And yet, she sat unnoticed. At a nearby table, a woman whispered to her companion, stealing quick glances in Eleanor's direction. "Do you see that?" she murmured. "Why hasn't she been served?" Her partner frowned. "I don't know, but it doesn't seem right." Still, Eleanor remained composed. This was not the first time she had encountered this kind of treatment, the kind that was quiet, insidious, and deniable. The kind that made itself known through delayed service, uninterested glances, and forced politeness. Ethan returned some time later, but his tone was no warmer. "Yeah, so we're a little short-staffed today," he said dismissively. "Might be a while before I can take your order." Across the room, one man had been watching everything unfold, his jaw tightening with every passing second. A sudden shift in the room. The door swung open, and in walked Daniel Carter, a man in his early 40s, dressed in a well-tailored suit that exuded quiet wealth and confidence. He scanned the restaurant, and when his eyes landed on Eleanor, his expression darkened. His mother, sitting at the worst table, still without service. As Daniel strode across the room, several patrons followed his movements, sensing a shift in the air. He stopped at Eleanor's table and bent slightly to kiss her cheek. "Sorry I'm late, Mom," he said, his voice warm but tight with restrained anger. Eleanor patted his hand. "It's all right, dear. I've had plenty of time to look at the menu." Daniel turned, his sharp gaze locking onto Ethan, who had suddenly gone stiff. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the restaurant's murmurs. "Is there a reason my mother has been sitting here for over 30 minutes without service?" Ethan stammered. Sir, we're just really busy tonight and—" Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Too busy to serve a paying customer? Or just this one?" The tension in the restaurant was now thick enough to cut with a knife. The other diners had gone silent, their attention fully on the unfolding confrontation. The shocking revelation. Then Daniel did something that made Ethan's face drain of color. He pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, then turned the screen around to face him. Ethan's eyes widened. On the screen was an article featuring Eleanor Carter, a retired civil rights attorney, a woman who had spent 4 decades fighting against racial discrimination in businesses and institutions across the country. The very type of case that could destroy an establishment like this. The room was dead silent as realization dawned. The hostess paled, the restaurant manager hurried over, and Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Daniel straightened, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "You had no idea who she was," he said, his tone eerily calm. "And that's the problem." Ethan swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't mean—" "Save it," Daniel cut him off. "We'll be leaving, but trust me, this isn't over." As Daniel helped his mother up, the restaurant's patrons watched in stunned silence, realizing they had just witnessed a quiet but powerful lesson about dignity, discrimination, and the danger of judging too quickly. And as Eleanor Carter walked out, her head held high, she didn't need to say a word. Her legacy had spoken for her. A lesson in respect. The moment the waiter realized his mistake. The minutes stretched on, and though Eleanor Carter kept her composed demeanor, a small part of her wondered how long this charade would continue. She reached for her water glass, only to find it still empty. Across the room, a waiter delivered a fresh glass of wine to a customer who had arrived long after she had. The contrast was glaring, but Eleanor merely folded her hands in her lap and waited. Then, at last, Ethan, the waiter, reappeared. Not with an apology or a glass of water, but carrying a tray destined for another table. As he passed Eleanor, he barely glanced at her. "Still haven't decided?" he asked, his tone casual, but with a dismissiveness that made it clear he didn't value her presence. It was as if the delay in service had been her fault. Eleanor looked up at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. Her voice, though gentle, carried a quiet strength. "I'm ready to order whenever you have a moment," she said, keeping her tone measured and polite. Ethan nodded, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. He didn't even bother writing down her order. What he didn't realize, however, was that someone else had been watching. Closely. A son's watchful eye. Near the bar, a man in his late 30s sat with a half-empty glass of sparkling water, his expression unreadable. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer, Daniel Carter had remained silent, but he had taken note of everything. The delayed service, the dismissive attitude, the way Ethan smiled and chatted effortlessly with other guests, but barely acknowledged his mother's existence. His fingers tapped lightly on the table, his patience thinning. What Ethan didn't know was that he wasn't just ignoring any customer. He was ignoring the owner's mother. Daniel had spent years building the Bellevue, pouring his heart into every detail, ensuring that his restaurant wasn't just a place to eat. It was a reflection of his values: respect, integrity, and fairness, the very principles his mother had instilled in him since childhood. Seeing her treated as though she didn't belong in a space he had created made his blood simmer. Yet he didn't react immediately. He wanted to see how far this would go, how Ethan would treat someone he assumed had no power. The boiling point, Ethan's indifference, only grew bolder. Daniel noticed how his expression darkened whenever he passed Eleanor's table, the way he smirked at another server, as if sharing an unspoken joke. Daniel's grip tightened around his glass. For the first time in his career, he felt powerless, not because he lacked authority, but because the one person he would never allow to be disrespected was being dismissed right in front of him. Across the restaurant, Eleanor remained calm. She glanced at her watch, a subtle but deliberate gesture. Daniel knew she wouldn't complain. She never did. His mother had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, but his actions would speak for her now. Daniel signaled to his restaurant manager, Dana, a middle-aged woman who had been with him for years. She approached his table cautiously. "Keep an eye on table 12, Daniel said under his breath, his voice firm. "I want to see how Ethan handles this. Don't intervene yet." Dana hesitated, but nodded. She knew better than to question Daniel when he spoke in that tone. Now, all that was left was for Ethan to dig his own grave. The moment of truth. Ethan strolled toward Eleanor's table again, this time empty-handed. "Ma'am, we're really busy tonight," he said, his tone laced with forced politeness. "It might be a while before I can take your order." Eleanor simply nodded. But Daniel had heard enough. He stood, straightened his blazer, and walked directly toward his mother's table. The murmur of conversations began to quiet as the patrons noticed the sudden shift in energy. As Daniel reached Eleanor's side, he leaned down, kissing her cheek with a warm, "Sorry, I'm late, Mom." Ethan blinked, his smirk vanishing as he took a full step back. "Mom?" Daniel turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Yes, my mother." Ethan swallowed. Daniel crossed his arms. "Tell me, Ethan, how long has she been waiting?" Silence. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The restaurant had gone still, every pair of eyes locked on them. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence, his anger masked in control, spoke volumes. "I want you to answer me," he continued, his voice sharp. "How long have you ignored this table? How many times did you walk past her without even bringing her water?" Ethan fumbled for words. "Sir, I didn't realize—" "No, you didn't. And that's the problem. A lesson he wouldn't forget." Dana approached, her expression tight. "Ethan, step into the back. Now." Ethan hesitated. Daniel's next words sealed his fate. "And when you get there, hand in your apron. You won't be needing it anymore." Ethan's face paled. "Sir, please." Daniel didn't flinch. "This restaurant is built on respect. If you can't uphold that, you don't belong here." The weight of the moment settled over the room. The very guests who had watched Eleanor be ignored were now watching her be honored. As Ethan shuffled away, Daniel turned back to his mother, his tone softening. "I'm sorry, Mom." Eleanor gave a knowing smile, placing her hand over his. "You handled it exactly as I raised you to." And just like that, order was restored, not just in the restaurant, but in the lesson that had just been served. A lesson in respect that no one would forget, but Daniel Carter believed in actions. And soon, Ethan would learn the consequences of his. The tension in the Bellevue had become impossible to ignore. Conversations had dulled, and more patrons were stealing glances toward Eleanor Carter, her quiet presence now commanding the attention it should have been given from the moment she walked in. Ethan, however, seemed oblivious, or worse, emboldened. As he passed by her table again, she politely raised her hand, her voice soft but unwavering. "Excuse me," she said, cutting through the low murmurs around her. Ethan paused, his expression tightening with impatience. "Yes?" he replied curtly, barely masking his irritation. Eleanor met his gaze, unshaken. "I'd like to place my order now, if you're not too busy," Ethan sighed audibly, rolling his shoulders as if serving her was an inconvenience. He glanced around, searching for an excuse. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered, turning away before she could respond. He never made it past the next table. A presence that commanded the room. Daniel rose from his seat. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, yet powerful. The moment shifted. The very air in the restaurant thickened as he crossed the room, his presence carrying an unmistakable weight. Without a word, he stopped just behind Ethan, who was laughing with another table, oblivious to the storm brewing beside him. It took a second for Ethan to notice. The casual arrogance on his face melted into confusion when he realized who was standing beside him. "Daniel, hey," Ethan stammered, attempting a nervous smile. "I didn't know you were here." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Oh, I've been here," he said, his voice calm but sharp as steel. "And I've been watching." Ethan swallowed, his smile faltering. Watching what? Daniel's gaze flicked toward his mother's table, then back to Ethan. "Watching you ignore my mother, who has been sitting there for almost 30 minutes, without so much as a glass of water." The color drained from Ethan's face. He glanced toward Eleanor, who now sat poised, her expression unreadable but locked on their interaction. Your mother?" Ethan stammered, his voice cracking. Daniel's tone sharpened. "Yes, my mother." He took a step closer, his voice unwavering. "The woman you've treated like an inconvenience. The woman you thought didn't deserve the same respect you've been showering on every other table in this room." The restaurant fell silent. Even the pianist stopped mid-note, his fingers hovering over the keys. The consequences of disrespect. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, scrambling for an excuse, but Daniel cut him off before he had the chance. "Save it," Daniel said, his voice colder than before. "There's no excuse for what you've done, and everyone here has seen it." The weight of his words hung in the air, pressing down like a hammer. He turned to Dana, the restaurant manager, who had been hovering near the bar, uncertain whether to intervene. "Dana," Daniel said, his voice steady, "take over table 12 and make sure my mother has everything she needs, immediately." Dana nodded quickly, rushing to Eleanor's table with a flurry of apologies. She filled her water glass and handed her a menu, her demeanor flustered but earnest. Daniel turned back to Ethan, his expression unreadable. "We'll discuss your future here later," he said, his voice cool and final. "For now, you're done for the day. Go home." Ethan stood frozen, his face a mix of humiliation and regret. Then, without a word, he untied his apron and walked out, the heavy restaurant door swinging shut behind him. Silence lingered for a beat longer before Daniel approached his mother's table. He crouched slightly, his once stern demeanor softening into something warmer. "You okay, Mom?" he asked quietly. Eleanor smiled, reaching out to pat his hand. "I'm fine, son. You handled that well?" Daniel exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. I should have stepped in sooner." She shook her head gently. "Number you let him reveal his character. Sometimes that's more powerful than confronting someone right away." A restaurant and a lesson forever changed. As the restaurant slowly returned to its usual hum of activity, one thing was clear. No one would forget what had just happened. The air was heavier, more thoughtful. Conversations picked up again, but the energy had shifted. Patrons who had witnessed the scene now looked at Eleanor Carter with a mixture of respect and quiet admiration. Daniel returned to his table, his face composed, though the lingering anger in his eyes hadn't entirely faded. Meanwhile, Dana made sure Mrs. Carter's meal was served promptly. She personally attended to her table, ensuring that everything was exactly as it should have been from the moment she walked in. Across the room, the young couple who had whispered about the delay earlier exchanged a look. "That was—" the woman started, shaking her head in disbelief. "A lesson," her partner finished, and a lesson it was. Because that night, the Bellevue didn't just serve food, it served a reminder that respect is not optional. A lesson in respect that would last beyond the night. Donna presented the dishes with an apology so sincere, it felt as if she were trying to undo the entire evening's missteps. Mrs. Eleanor Carter accepted the apology with her usual grace, offering a small nod before turning her attention to the food. She didn't need grand gestures or speeches. Her quiet dignity had already spoken volumes. At another table, a young couple who had been watching the entire scene leaned toward each other. "I can't believe he treated her like that," the woman whispered, shaking her head. Her partner sighed. "It makes you wonder how often this happens, and no one says anything." The woman's voice softened. "It's not just about what we see. It's about what we do when it happens." Across the room, Elijah Carter overheard their conversation as he walked past on his way back to his mother. Their words stayed with him. He thought about the countless times people like Ethan had gotten away with mistreatment simply because no one had spoken up. A mother's wisdom. As Elijah sat down, his mother reached across the table and took his hand gently. "You've built something beautiful here, Elijah," she said softly. Her eyes, filled with warmth and quiet pride, studied her son's face. "But remember, a place like this isn't just about food or ambiance. It's about how people feel when they walk through those doors." Elijah sighed, his voice tinged with regret. "I let you down tonight, Mom." She shook her head. "No, you didn't. You gave everyone here a chance to see the truth." Her fingers tightened around his. "And you handled it with integrity. That's what matters." He exhaled slowly, her words sinking into his chest, like an anchor grounding him. Around them, the staff seemed more attentive, the service more thoughtful. It wasn't just about avoiding another incident. It was about the unspoken lesson that had settled into the room. Respect and kindness weren't optional. They were the foundation of everything. As Mrs. Carter finished her meal, she glanced around the restaurant, her eyes settling briefly on Dana, who gave her a small, apologetic smile. There was no bitterness in Eleanor's expression, only quiet satisfaction that the moment had left an impression. For Elijah, however, the lesson wasn't just for Ethan or the staff. It was a reminder for himself, too. Leadership wasn't just about managing a restaurant. It was about upholding the values that made it worth visiting, stepping into the night with pride. As the evening wound down, Mrs. Carter prepared to leave, her calm demeanor unchanged. Elijah walked her to the door, holding it open as she stepped out into the crisp night air. For a moment they stood together, the soft glow from the restaurant's windows illuminating their faces. She turned to him, her voice filled with a quiet but undeniable strength. "You did good, son." Elijah gave a faint but genuine smile. "I still wish it hadn't happened at all." She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "What matters is how you responded. You gave everyone in there something to think about, something they'll carry with them. That's real change." Elijah nodded, watching as she made her way to the waiting car by the curb. Just before getting in, she turned back and offered him one last smile. A culture shift inside. The restaurant staff quietly cleaned up, the earlier incident still fresh in their minds. At the bar, Dana gathered the team for a brief meeting. Her tone was serious, yet constructive. "What happened tonight is a wake-up call," she began, her eyes sweeping over the team. "Not just about how we treat our guests, but about the culture we're creating here. Every person who walks through those doors deserves respect. No exceptions." The staff nodded, their expressions solemn. Ethan's absence was palpable, a reminder of what happens when prejudice replaces professionalism. As Elijah returned inside, he glanced around the now emptying dining room. The events of the evening weighed on him, but they also reaffirmed his commitment to making the Bellevue more than just a restaurant. It had to be a place where dignity and kindness were served alongside the finest meals. A night that wouldn't be forgotten. For the guests who had witnessed it all, the night would linger in their minds. They had come for fine dining, but left with something much more valuable, a lesson in integrity. A reminder that respect is not a privilege, it is a right. That night, Pemberton's Bistro wasn't just a restaurant. It became the setting for a powerful lesson. It reminded everyone present of the value of respect, the importance of speaking up, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to let injustice go unnoticed. Now ask yourself, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed silent? These moments happen every day, often in ways we don't expect. Let this story serve as a reminder to always choose dignity, empathy, and courage. If this story resonated with you, share it, because change begins with awareness.